Welcome back to a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. It is Thursday, March 22nd, 2018. Hi again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani, back inside our New York City studio. We have survived another storm. These guys did. A couple others didn't, but they shall remain nameless. That is Jeff Wagenheim of ESPN.com and the Washington Post, a.k.a. the man in the shirt. And, of course, that is Mr. Chuck Mindenhall, a.k.a. the man in the hat of The Ringer and MMAfighting.com. Okay, guys, no time for jokes, no time for pleasantries right off the bat. We've got some breaking news to discuss. This doesn't happen often. In fact, more often than not, the breaking news happens after our show.
It's kind of refreshing, isn't it?
Yes. So this is exciting. So, Chris Taylor of BJPenn.com reported around 90 minutes ago that Rafael dos Anjos versus Colby Covington is in the works for UFC 224, which is May 12th in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and it will be for an interim title. Now, according to the people that I've talked to, yes, this is in the works, close to being finalized, but this is a thing right now. There's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot of layers to this. Let's just start with this question right off the bat. Your immediate thoughts when you saw that the UFC was moving in this direction?
I would say I had two quick thoughts. One would be the next Colby Covington fight happening in Rio is kind of ingenious. I mean, you know, they love the story. They love creating the story. The guys, you know, if anybody out there that has not already paid attention to this, he's been dissing Brazil, you know, putting Chael Sonnen to shame with the way he disses Brazil. And so having him have to compete down there is you know, it's perfect positioning. That's the one thing. The other side of it, if it's an interim title fight, I don't quite understand what the necessity for that is if the champion is ready to come back pretty soon. So it was kind of like, those are my immediate two thoughts.
And the champion, Chuck, is Tyron Woodley.
Yeah.
Last time he fought was at the very end of July of last year. He is recovering from shoulder surgery, and he has said on multiple occasions that he is ready and willing to return in July. So not quite May, not quite June, but July. So around 2 months later, your thoughts when you found out about this?
That was kind of my first thought was, okay, so how long is Woodley sidelined for? I wasn't quite sure. I was talking to you beforehand. You said in July. I was like, okay, so that's a year. But really what it seemed like to me, and I saw Guilherme Cruz actually brought this up as well, you know, Rocky Pennington hasn't fought in 18 months, or it's been quite a while, and Amanda Nunes, of course, backed out of a fight recently, and there might just be some security or some insurance there to book a second title fight just in case something happens to that main event, which makes some sense to me. And it also could be just a way to say, like, hey, Tyron Woodley, this is the guy you're going to face. Whoever wins this fight is who you're going to face, and it sort of simplifies the process. Because as we know, obviously with Woodley, you know, he's very vocal about the kind of who he wants to fight and things like that. I think that this is just the UFC's way of saying, like, why don't we simplify the process while you're out, and then we'll set something up.
Right.
I had two immediate reactions. My first one was, gosh, I mean, we've waited this long for Woodley to come back.
That's what's
He's
weird
returning in
about it.
July. Why are you doing an interim title fight in May? And then once I got over that, I thought, well, this is actually brilliant for the two fighters involved. This is actually a victory for Colby Covington and Rafael dos Anjos, because when you fight for a belt, even if it's an interim belt, you get paid more.
Right.
And there has been a very weird thing going on at 170. I know yesterday it almost feels like everyone's just squatting. Everyone's waiting for someone above them to take the bait, to fight them, and you have this situation where in the top 10, like literally no one's fighting. Everyone's just waiting. Darren Till's involved in a situation where he can't find an opponent. We'll talk to him in a second. He's somewhat related to this story as well. So now here you have a situation where it almost feels like the UFC had to incentivize these two fighters to take the fight. And they said, okay, look, we're going to give you an interim title fight. We just need someone to fight. We need this division to move along. And I feel like that's what happened. So I almost feel like indirectly Covington and RDA together, but not really together, if you get what I'm saying, beat the UFC in this one, and the UFC was forced to actually give up, you know, their stance of no interim title fights for now, and actually bring it into the fold.
I mean, I think that ultimately it comes down to those of us who might be sticklers for this kind of thing and say, well, you know, this is not worthy of being a title fight, and maybe we just need to set our opinions aside a little bit, because this is something that essentially, as Chuck says, it's really setting up the next title fight. Right. That's essentially what
it's the number one contender
and I
belt.
suppose that's supposed to be what interim belts are for anyway.
Sure.
But you know what? If these guys are getting paid a little bit more power to them. And so even though that was an immediate, you know, instantaneous negative thought I had about it, I get over that pretty quickly. The guys deserve to compete, and this is really to me, this is kind of an ingenious booking to have it happen where it's going to be happening.
It certainly adds value to that card, right?
Sure.
I mean, like you look at UFC 224 now and you think, well, that obviously gets a little bit better. And besides, I really, honestly, when Colby Covington had beat Damian Maia, there was still a thought that he may be the next guy in line until RDA, of course, looked, turned in his performance, and I think he kind of jumped it. But at least you have the right 1A and 1B going against each other in the situation. There wasn't some weird element being introduced. Like if Darren Till, for instance, wasn't going to be in Liverpool and he's going to end up on this card, it might have been a little. It might have been stranger in that sense.
How do you feel about the idea, as Jeff brought up, and he seems pretty pleased with it, the idea of having Covington, after everything that's happened, go back to Brazil? Because it's different now, right? Because last time he said filthy animals, all that stuff, he had the Verdun thing. This is all kind of after the Maia fight. Leading up to the Maia fight, he said some things, but it's been a lot more since. Now going back, how do you feel about it?
I mean, the guy obviously embraces being a kind of heel. And not just like a fake heel. I feel like the guy he's a little more smugness and he has a little more of a chip on his shoulder and things like that. I don't think it's all play, I don't think he's all airs, but I think I do like it. I mean, honestly, back in the day when Chael Sonnen was just lighting a match and throwing it on Brazil, it was like so irreverent. It was so disrespectful, and it was so like dismissive of the champion at the time, Anderson Silva, that I remember thinking like how brilliant if he does have to go to Brazil and face Anderson Silva on that terrain. Like this is back in the day before we were, before UFC, what was it, 134 when they first went to Brazil. This was before then. Yeah, so it was like before then we hadn't seen exactly how things were going to play out. But I still love, I mean, honestly, like I've always loved the idea of enemy territory, whether it's going to Cleveland, Alistair Overeem did to fight Miocic or whatever it is. I just think he's the perfect guy to go do that, and he'll rev some things up, I think, in the right way, and he'll add some excitement to that card. I don't know if Amanda Nunes and Rocky Pennington are actually going to generate that kind of buzz, but I feel like he will, so I do like that booking. I like him going there.
Yeah, well, Chael Sonnen, when you bring him up, he did a lot of the same stuff, but he did it with a kind of a comic, almost exaggerated edge, and that kind of softened. I mean, ultimately, at the base of these kind of things, that there's a certain xenophobia that it's real, that I've often reacted negatively toward. But at least with Sonnen, there was that comic edge. There really isn't that with Covington, and that's one of the things that kind of gnaws at me. Like I know you mentioned Darren Till, and he's going to be fighting in Liverpool, and he needs an opponent. And I know, as I've thought about that, Covington was one of the names that came up, and I thought, well, he could go into Liverpool, and everybody's there to see Darren Till, and he's going to come in there and be the antagonist, the same role he's going to play now. But I was kind of like, well, I'm not that interested in it. There's nothing organic about it. It's just this guy trying to be a heel. But now he's going to go into the place where he actually has made his specific, insults. His insults have been specifically geared toward Brazil, and so now he's going to go pay the piper.
The fun thing about it too is obviously like the matchup itself, because RDA has looked so good in his last couple of fights. You feel like if people wanted to view it as, well, this is a comeuppance for a guy like Colby Covington, who's got to go into the situation and fight a buzzsaw basically in his own backyard, essentially. That's kind of fun too, because now you see really what happens to Colby Covington in a fight against a guy who I think he'll probably be the underdog against.
Who do you like in that fight right now, top of your head?
And because it was just, I mean, that's a tough. But the way RDA has looked, if he looks anything like that, just how good he's been since he's been at 170, I couldn't pick against him.
Yeah, I think RDA all the way. Ultimately, Covington got the win over Damian Maia and really deserved the win. But and Maia has improved a little bit, certainly in his striking. He's not as one-dimensional as he once was, but he's certainly not an elite striker. And he was doing pretty well against Covington earlier in that fight. RDA is at a whole different level as a striker. He may not be the grappler that Maia is, but he's certainly a damn good grappler. And so I just think he'll have too much, But hey, that's why they book the fights.
He's so good in the scrambles and the pressuring and all that stuff. You feel like some of the things that Colby Covington has been able to do as a more of a dogged wrestler, he probably can offset. It just makes it it's fun to contemplate, some of those scrambles and stuff, the way it'll play out. But I mean, honestly, this thing it's so fresh. It's like you have to almost kind of like let that play out a little bit and think about it.
I hope that there's some kind of clause in that contract, some fine print that states that Colby Covington gets a little more extra, security. Pre and post fight, especially if he wins, because I can't imagine if he wins what he's going to say on the mic. Like him or not, we need to give Colby Covington some credit. I remember being at his fight last year, around I think it was maybe in March of last year. Can't recall the exact one, but he was, buried on the undercard of a Las Vegas pay-per-view. And I remember him starting to talk about Robbie Lawler and Donald Cerrone, some of the top 170 pounders. And we had never thought of Colby Covington, in the radius of those guys, right? And I was like, what is this guy talking about? Like, he is nowhere near Robbie Lawler, who at the time was still champion. And what he has been able to do in the last 15 or so months, I mean, to get to this point, to be fighting for an interim belt, where there's going to be more heat on that fight than any other fight on that card. He is going to be public enemy number one, which at the end of the day is really what you want as a fighter, for people to care, whether it's to adore you or to despise you. He has succeeded. Now, we can sort of go back and forth on the methods and the words that he's used at times, but he has succeeded in what has been his mission, to get people to care about him. It's pretty damn impressive to do that in a very short amount of time.
People hate him, like the spoiler that he put out for the Star Wars thing, and that just happened in this last fight, and he's like, ha ha, whatever.
Oh, Verdum.
It's just one of those things where you think, like, he actively hits nerves, he jangles people's nerves, and I think that sometimes that can be very beneficial. If you're calling guys out, that's the great thing about fighting, is there's always like, well, your punishment now is you have to go fight RDA, right? You can look at it that way, and that's pleasing in its own way. If you're looking at Colby Covington that way, you could look at, you could say, like, RDA will be his comeuppance.
Sure.
I mean, his talking has certainly elevated his profile, but ultimately it comes down to fighting, and his fighting is what's got him where he is. I mean, really. He could have talked all he wanted, but if he went out there
he was winning before he was talking, and no one cared about it.
Right, but
once he started to talk and win.
He was at a different level, and now, I mean, if he had gone out there and Demian Maia had just submitted him in the first round,
of course, no one cared,
and we would have been like, okay, keep talking, boy. It would not have mattered at all.
You have to do both.
You have to be able to. You have to be able to back it up.
It's not even that aesthetically pleasing. It's
you
not
have
like,
to do both. But one isn't just enough. Like, winning isn't enough anymore in this day and age for people to truly want to see you either win or lose.
He's 100% an example of that, and you've been harping about this for years. If you get the chance to be on a microphone and you have the spotlight at that moment, you should have something at the ready. You should be prepared to think big picture and to call your shots, because we've seen it pay off a million times. And I think that's the other thing about him, is obviously, like you mentioned, he was in relative obscurity not that long ago, in a division where it's very difficult to to kind of catapult yourself up into that top space. So kudos to him, man. I mean, he did win. They weren't like the prettiest fights or anything like that, but he won, but he knew how to use the microphone.
Also deserves credit. I mean, Chael went to Brazil for a press conference, and I remember that being a huge deal. And I know he taped Tough Brazil later on, but the tide had kind of passed.
Yeah.
In terms of his feud with Anderson and the Brazilians, like, Colby is going back to the scene of the crime. He couldn't leave his hotel room after he beat Demian Maia and called everyone filthy animals. He had to stay there and then get, security to escort him just to go to the bus to go to the airport. And now he's coming back on a pay-per-view in Rio. After everything that he said and the feud with Verdum and all that stuff, I legitimately hope that he has security. But I agree with you.
Got Reed Harris, man. Reed will take care.
Yeah, Reed, exactly. Just sit outside.
Reed.
I couldn't agree with you more. This fight had to be in Brazil, right? Because he's fighting a Brazilian. It had to be. It couldn't be in Chicago or anywhere else, Europe. This had to be in Brazil, and I'm thankful that they got it right on that front. Had to be. Now, let's play devil's advocate here, because I do like the fact that they're both getting money. They're both fighting for a belt because that means money. But can we admit, like, the interim belt does dilute? Once again, one of these guys wins and puts it around his waist. If RDA wins and he says, oh, I'm now the fifth man, I think off the top of my head, who's won a belt in 2 different weight classes, it's not the same. It dilutes everything. And there is a part of me that wishes we didn't have to resort to this. I know I just said that I'm happy that they made the money and they needed to incentivize them, but there was a time not that long ago where this didn't have to happen. You didn't have to have a number one contender fight for an interim belt, basically.
Right. This is the seesaw that we find ourselves on. On the one hand, we don't want to see belts cheapened. On the other hand, we do want to see fighters who are putting themselves out there. We want to see them get paid the most they can get paid, and ultimately. Sometimes those two things don't work together.
The bigger issue is just when you introduce an interim belt, it's so rare that everything so neatly falls in line that you compare the two that should be fighting. I mean, we've seen it with Conor McGregor and recently, but let's just say there's another setback with Tyrone Woodley, and all of a sudden you're defending. You know what I mean? Like these types of things, and that's what I don't like. Is if it's an interim title, it's almost like you can't make a guarantee that that's still going to be. He's going to be fighting for the actual title. They're going to marry those belts. You just can't guarantee it. That's where it's. I don't like that. I don't like the digression of the belt. You know what I mean?
If you're Woodley, who are you rooting for on May 12th?
Man, I don't know. I mean,
I feel like it should be Covington because there's more heat there because they actually have a history.
But man, Woodley's so weird when it comes to this stuff, isn't it?
He wants nothing to do with
That's
them.
what's so weird. So I don't know. I would think that too, but I remember we had this discussion before, and we were kind of puzzled as to why he's not embracing actually wanting to fight the guy. But maybe that changes after this whole scenario. So I could see him wanting that fight more.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I guess I would say, not to be wishy-washy about this, but I would say that if I'm Woodley, I'm rooting for a definitive finish. I mean, somebody to go out there and just smoke the other guy to really elevate his own status so that he becomes that, the monster. On the next fight poster, he's the monster hovering behind Woodley. And so I don't know that it matters who it is because, look, we've seen RDA look like a killer. We haven't seen Covington Beat as ferocious, but he keeps winning, and he also brings the heat on the mic. So it kind of evens out in that respect.
Okay, it's well documented that Tyron Woodley has had his issues with the UFC brass, Dana White in particular. If you're him, and I've reached out to him, and he did reply, but he's saying no comment for now. Are you upset? Are you offended? Are you saying, here I am, I just fought 4 times in the span of a year for you guys, and I'm about to come back in July. Why are you diluting my belt? Can you see Woodley having an issue with this?
Yeah, of course. I mean, just knowing Tyrone Woodley, just in terms of the types of things that he's butted heads with, I could see how he would look at this as a little bit of a slap in the face. Even if there is a strategic underlying aspect to, like what I mentioned earlier about maybe just security of having a belt on the line at 224 just in case.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I do feel like, obviously, we've dealt with Dana White. We've watched the UFC for so long that you do know the gamesmanship. You do know how they, where they can sort of corner situations and how they can play things to their advantage and all that stuff. So, yeah, I think all of that comes into play here because basically, Woodley has basically fought real contender. It's not like he wasn't Michael Bisping. But I feel like people get confused. They think that because he mentions guys like Nate Diaz or Nick Diaz and things like that, we then want to discount that he's ducking this. He's really not. Yeah. But I feel like that's still the perception, you know what I mean? And there's just a lot of disconnect there between the UFC, between Woodley and the fans. So to me, this simplifies it from the UFC's perspective, but I really do believe that Woodley probably takes it a little bit as a slap in the face.
Look, is this a bigger slap in the face than you just defended your belt at Madison Square Garden and you're like, basking in the victory, and all of a sudden somebody from the UFC comes over, takes your belt away and slings it over Conor McGregor's shoulder so he can have 2 in the cage? I mean, Woodley has had. If we can spend the entire hour talking about the different things that have happened to Woodley that have been disrespectful. And the guys, he is he's a champion's champion as far as I'm concerned. He has fought the top guys. I mean, and I think he will continue to do so. And I think that this will, hopefully this fight in Rio will elevate somebody to the point where it'll be a big fight for.
I'm curious
Woodley.
To hear.
At least we have some clarity at 170. Don't we?
Well, because he's actually the one who's been saying like, this guy doesn't deserve it, this guy doesn't deserve it. So now, if Covington beats RDA, very hard to deny him. Right. And if RDA wins another fight, he's still undefeated at 170. But I'm curious to see how he approaches like his first comments on this because he's almost damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. If he says, look, yeah, I understand. Well, really, do you understand you're coming back in 2 months? It's kind of unprecedented to do something like this. And then if you complain about it, people will call him a complainer once again. So I'm curious to see how he's going to navigate these waters.
Well, I mean, he can certainly celebrate the matchup and say, hey, now we're going to get some clarity who my next guy is.
Okay.
And kind of dodge the whole idea that there's a belt there.
Fair. Just not acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Let's stick with the welterweight division because there's some big news involving one of the rising stars in the UFC's welterweight division. His name is Darren Till. And earlier on, not that long ago, PT Carroll reported that the UFC was going to go to Dublin, Ireland on May 27th. Well, some things happened along the way. They called an audible, and now they're going to Liverpool for the first time. a market that has, as I said, never hosted the UFC, but has been very successful in terms of quote-unquote regional MMA. Cage Warriors in particular does a phenomenal job there, and there's this influx of young Scouser fighters who have come up that have done very well. Not a lot of them are in the UFC right now, but that market is primed for a UFC event. And they're coming with Darren Till, and he's going to headline the show. But it's very rare that the UFC announces a show with a headliner but without an opponent. They don't do this often, but in this case, they have done it. And they're having a hard time finding someone to fight Darren Till. We'll get to that dilemma in a second, but first, let's just celebrate the idea of the UFC calling the audible on Dublin, which, let's be honest, Dublin's a fantastic market. The most famous fighter of all time is from Dublin. He wasn't fighting on that card, right? So there aren't a lot of lower-end fighters who can maybe headline a fight night in Dublin. The audible, I think, is a smart move. What did you make of the decision to take the event away from Dublin and then bring it to Liverpool with Darren Till as the headliner?
Well, let me just say this. If you were taking an event out of Dublin, you damn well better bring it. I mean, you better put it in a place where it's going to be good, because you're taking it out of a venue that is that's electric, you know. And whether McGregor's on the card or he isn't, Dublin still is a place that is going to bring excitement. So you better have a good plan. And it seems to me that you know, the UFC is totally showing its hand that we're coming to Liverpool and we come with Darren Till, and we're not announcing an opponent yet. That's
because they don't have one.
Because, well, not only that, but they almost don't need it yet. They know the whole reason they're going to that place is to showcase this guy. So I think we have to, if we're thinking about who's going to be doing that, you know, is going to be on the other side of the octagon from him, I think we have to look at it through that lens of, you know, who's going to showcase the Darren Till skills.
Really, I love it on a lot of levels. One being that Darren Till, I think, is a star, is a rising star. To tailor an event to him at this stage, just like they did with Conor McGregor when he fought Brandao, like those types of things always, they make sense, because I believe you see them in an environment like that, right? If you see Liverpool come out, regardless who he fights, and you see that kind of excitement, them getting behind him, it's infectious. It still translates even when you're watching it, regardless if it's on TV, on a computer, or whatever. I feel like you see some other side of them, especially in the lead up to the fight and everything like that, because the spotlight is directly on them. So I think they've got a guy that they're marketing correctly, and they're finally like kind of tailoring him, you know, zeroing in on a very specific location where he's from and all this. So to me, I'd like to see more of this, honestly. But I'm glad that they got this. I believe they got it right. I mean, it's a lot more exciting to contemplate, regardless who he fights. Really, it's a showcase fight for him. So they really could go any direction they want. They don't have to place him against a monster. They could just showcase him against a guy who's not the greatest talent in the league.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Diego Brandao. I mean, that's what the UFC did when they were going to give a showcase to Conor McGregor. That's a guy, and that
was. Did you want to see the same model recreated here? Because I remember there were some people, Jeff Wagenheim being one of them, who are like, I'm not really buying it. They're matching him up against the right guy.
No, I was not.
Why not do the same with Darren?
I mean, I don't know. My issue was not so much the matching of him to the matching of McGregor to build him up to the point where he got to be a star. My issue was not the matchups. It was more that right from the start, when he was going to be fighting Diego Brandao, people were talking about him like he was the second coming of whatever. And I think that we needed to wait and see what he was going to be.
I believe you said we're still in the pilot.
Yeah.
Stages.
Yeah, so. and I still believe that, but I think
we're still in the pilot stage.
No, not now, but back then I think, and yeah, exactly. But that was the appropriate kind of matchup at that time for him, and I think that the appropriate matchup for Till is going to be somebody who's going to be able to go out there and who he can look good against. Not to say you're not setting him up to win necessarily, but somebody who's going to fight the kind of fight that Till is going to be able to do what he does.
The old UFC model used to be like, we're pitting the best against the best. And you often hear, for example, I was listening to Bill Simmons and your colleague David Shoemaker talk about this, how one of the problems that the UFC always faces is that they take two great guys and one of them kills each other off, and then you don't have that star anymore. And here we have a situation where it seems like everyone is almost willing, the UFC, to say, like, look, don't mess this up with this guy. We're okay if you book him in a sort of squash match. But again, they're having trouble finding that opponent. So you got, a guy like Kamaru Usman who's engaged back and forth. You shake your head. This would be a disaster, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't
don't do this.
I wouldn't want to see that fight right away. I mean, the bottom line is...
If you're Darren Till?
Well, I mean, for the very reason you just said, you have two guys that are running parallel that are both big-time intrigues. I wouldn't want to see them cross yet. Right. That's the whole thing. I just feel like it'd be premature to cross them now. I'd rather see, especially because this is a showcase event in Liverpool for Till, I'd rather see them book against, like Edwards or somebody else, somebody who would make more sense to just basically.
Even Wonderboy seems like too much of a risk. Not to say that Darren can't beat Wonderboy. I fully believe. Like, do you guys agree?
That's not the fight for now, though.
Darren Till has that superstar quality, right? Like, you see him standing there with Dan Hardy and John Gooden on the broadcast. First of all, he looked like he was like 3 times as big as Hardy.
All he had to do was shake his head at Edwards on that call out, and everybody's like, "Oh, that was great." That's all he did is shake his head.
He does have that quality to him, which is great. They need more of those guys.
Yeah.
Wonderboy to me seems way too premature, right? And plus, what happens if Wonderboy wins? Like, he's not getting another crack at Woodley at this point.
Yeah.
So you've got Wonderboy out there, who, by the way, his dad continues to tell me that fight's not happening, so we don't really need to talk about it. Masvidal says he can't do the fight, so we can scrap him. The Mike Perry option was a great one at the time, but now he's lost 2 in a row. And if I'm Mike Perry, I want nothing to do with that fight because you need to get back on track and maybe take some time off. I love the Leon Edwards one. Yeah. The guy has won 5 in a row. He's from England. He gets on the mic. It's a perfect call out. Yeah. It's the right kind of call out. He walks off afterwards. And the other thing is, I saw some people say, like, Leon Edwards doesn't deserve that fight. Go look at their records. Go compare their records. Other than the Donald Cerrone fight for Darren Till, they have equal resumes. You can argue that Edwards is more impressive than Till's. Till was lucky to get the Cerrone fight when he got it. The UFC is wanting to push him, great. But Edwards has won 5 in a row against some pretty solid. You just interviewed a guy that Darren Till fought. No, Darren Till fought to a draw. Who's not even in the UFC anymore? Nicholas Dalby. Like, let's not get too crazy here. He hasn't won like 4 in a row against the creme de la creme at this point.
And I think it's a little bit unfair if we characterize these kinds of showcases as the star of the show against. A can. There's these guys. I mean, Diego Brandao is not a bad fighter. Diego Brandao
originally was supposed to be Cole Miller.
Right.
If you recall, he was on a roll.
These are good quality fighters, but it just was the appropriate challenge. I mean, it was still a challenge for Conor McGregor to get out there in Dublin in front of his people and face a guy who was a competent fighter and look as good as he did. I think that the same kind of challenge awaits Darren Till. Go out there in front of your people and fight somebody who is going to be a challenge, not a walkover, but somebody who's going to be a challenge. But you can do what you do. And that's
another intriguing option would be that Max Griffin I was just talking about.
Yeah.
Just a guy who beat Mike Perry, right? So then you put him in there. Yeah, but he's obviously like a.
So Griffin to me feels more like Brandao. I think Edwards right now is better than Brandao was back then.
I'm saying they could do any of those options and it would still be okay for me. Yeah. Like just watching that because it's really designed around him.
So avoid the big name. Like you don't need. They could probably go on sale with those tickets with Till versus TBA, and that thing probably sells out, right? So then what's the point? Why even risk it?
Yeah.
But I don't know. The old UFC, they would risk it. And I feel like the fans demanded that they risk it, but I feel like we've become a little...
It's also fun because, they go to Liverpool, it becomes its own carry. It's just like when they finally came to New York, right? Like, it became one of the stars of the show, at least for the first one. People cared about it just because it was New York. And, then it had all these great fights. But Liverpool is one of those, just like in Dublin. When they first went to Dublin, I think at 93, there was no... Marcus the hand grenade, what Irish hand grenade was like the only guy who was even associated to Irish as far as I remember. There might have been one other guy on there, but it was like Dan Henderson and Rich Franklin, right?
Yeah.
So the idea was Dublin, right? So this is Liverpool. I feel like they have a guy who makes sense to it. So you already have two major components, just Liverpool and Till, right? So I don't really think you need to sell it.
Tom Egan, by the way.
Yes, that's what it was.
Tom first ever Irish fighter. People forget that he was the first ever.
I just saw him at the Bellator event. He was looking good.
Oh, that's right. Because he lives in the New England area. I'm really curious to see. I know that they're actively looking, and they're looking in all directions, and they wanted those big name fights, the Wonderboy, the Masvidals. I just don't feel like it's worth it at this point. But they've got some. Like, the best thing about the Covington RDA thing is that I feel like it's going to open the floodgates a little bit at 170 because this
had to get something going.
This is crazy what's going on in that division. Everyone's waiting for the guy above him. The guy above him is waiting for the guy above him, and no one's fighting. Yeah. I feel like that's a big problem.
I'm sure Shan Shelby loves his job.
Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, if you know that your next title fight is essentially set up, then you might want to start fighting to be the next guy.
Exactly. By the way, speaking of that London card, it was a fun card. There were a lot of great performances, and typically when they go to these markets, these big markets, but the cards are much maligned. I feel like, especially like the local fighters, meaning the English fighters or the European fighters, they up their game, and there were some awesome performances, a couple of record-breaking, buzzer beaters, so to speak. But I want to focus quickly on the heavyweight division because we saw Alexander Volkov defeat Fabricio Verdum. And it feels like for the first time in a while, there's an influx of fresh faces at heavyweight. Volkov being one of them, Curtis Blades being another who's fighting Alistair Overeem, coming off a pretty big win. Tai Tuivasa, who's fighting Andrei Arlovsky, coming off a pretty big win as well. And I still feel like Ngannou needs to be in that mix, even though he's come. And
I love how people dismiss him. Like, I got beat by Miocic. You're like, he's throwing more. It's the guy's fine.
Of those guys, and feel free to throw, is there any that you see as a, like, you know, there's holes that you can pick in each one of them, and I don't know how much stock I want to put, but of those guys, is there someone that you're really high on right now? Is it the Volkov who, you know, just beat Verdum? Do you see that? A guy who lost 2 in a row in Bellator, by the way, before leaving.
I know.
What are you thinking?
I don't know. I mean, I think they all have their merits, but I guess what I'm thinking is that every one of them is, you know, needs another couple fights before they're going to reach that point where I'm.
Right.
But in heavyweight particularly, you know, you're just like that far away. I mean, the guy that impressed me the most recently, I guess, is Blades. But you know, Volkov's performance, especially weathering, that was, I guess that's what the guys that I'm interested in. Well, when you see a fighter who goes out there and can weather something and then come back, you know, it's, to me, that's more impressive than the guy who goes out there and just smokes somebody like that, because it shows me 2 parts of their game.
Yeah, I mean, I want to see more of Tuivasa, obviously, like, because he did strike me as, like, not just the next Mark Hunt, but sort of a guy who was a younger version who has it going for him way earlier than Mark Hunt did, you know what I mean? Even though Mark was around forever, his record wasn't that great. So it's one of those type of things. He's been around this guy for a long time, so I kind of want to see a little more on him. But I think that he may have the look of somebody in the next year who could make a, you know, pretty big wave. And I also think Francis Ngannou, man,
I feel like he's the pick.
As soon as he gets a little more experience and he gets in there, and if they do that Derek Lewis fight or whatever they're going to do, like, they could pretty much plug him in against anybody, and it'd be, I think, exciting. That guy just brings that kind of.
Which direction do you go if you're the UFC booking Francis Ngannou? Do you do the Lewis fight, or do you do the Mark Hunt fight?
Man.
Next, I know he wants Brock Lesnar.
Depends. Do you want to get rid of your Mark Hunt problem? Like,
right.
But we've said this a million times, and Mark Hunt just is that guy who they can't. He's an unflushable, man. So it's like, I think if they did that fight, it would obviously be, it would make some sense, you know, Ngannou. I think that's the kind of, I don't know if he's going to sharpen the things that we saw that he was deficient in against Mark Hunt, but it's obviously a nice.
Against Miocic.
Yeah, yes, I'm sorry, against Miocic. But I think that's a fun fight to contemplate. But man, if you could get Derek Lewis and Ngannou to fight, I mean, to me, that's one of the more compelling fights that I've contemplated in a long, long time. I just
they
feel
have
like,
a history, right? They've been going back and forth for a year.
And just both of them being such, you know, aggressive punchers and carrying so much power. I think that would be that would be the fight I would put together.
Yeah, I mean that would be that'd be gangbusters. I mean, and Derek Lewis, I mean, he's not gone out there and been wrestling heavy, but he certainly can, you know, he certainly is good in the clinch. He exhibits some of the skill set that Miocic used against Ngannou, and so that would be, I think, a little bit more of a test of where Ngannou has progressed than the Hunt one, because the Hunt one is going to be, you know, 2 guys, you know, slugging each other.
Were you cage side for Ngannou's fight in Boston? Were you out there?
I was in the back.
Okay, because you were sitting up there.
Oh, yeah.
Because there was a couple. I mean, it's always a game of like centimeters and inches, but there was a couple of those early shots. So that first round was just as crazy as it could be, because any of those shots land and it's over for either guy.
Yeah.
But there's a couple of those shots where he just so narrowly missed Miocic, and you're like, that's the game right there. And as the fight went on, obviously he loses steam. And I mean, we could be talking about this guy right now as being, you know, the biggest thing to happen to the heavyweight division since, you know, maybe ever. But he just missed.
It's up to Francis, but I really do believe that the loss could be the best thing to ever happen to him, because clearly there were issues.
Yeah.
I mean, even on Monday when I was talking to him, he said, yeah, it was a mistake to go back to France, you know, 3 weeks before the fight. So hopefully he has learned some things. I still feel like there's a problem with his setup, that he doesn't have necessarily like a team around him. The amount of time that he's spending at the Performance Institute, to me, is a bit of a flawed approach. You know, that's a good place to go to recover, to do rehab. Maybe you want to get in some, you know, some training, but like that shouldn't necessarily be your home if you're a top level fighter. I want to vote for the Lewis fight as much as I love Mark Hunt, and I would not be upset. I just love the backstory there and the fact that they keep going back and forth, and Lewis, you know, makes fun of him online. That to me is just amazing. He threw me a curveball when he brought up the Brock Lesnar thing, and I kind of got a mixed reaction online. I thought everyone would just be like, of course. What did you guys think of that idea?
There was no red tape. Like, it was just as simple as making, hey, Brock, you want to fight this guy? I'd be like, do it. I think that it's just that where he's coming from, and I don't even know when he's available. Like, so there's complication to it, right?
Meaning Brock.
Brock, yeah.
Yeah, well, he would be available in around a month and change, but he still has to go through 6 more months of his suspension.
So, given all of that,
unless they find a way to waive it, like they did the testing prior to 200.
Yeah, right. I mean, talk about two guys capable of exploiting the other one's weaknesses.
Yeah, of
course. I mean, that's about as
can't
blatant
imagine
an example there is.
Isn't that good? Isn't that what we want, or no?
Well, it depends on how you look at it. I mean, as a sport called mixed martial arts, the ultimate is when you get two guys who are pretty well-rounded and who can go at each other. But it certainly is, right now, the Francis Ngannou of right now, who had a lot of trouble with Stipe's wrestling, is going to have some trouble with Brock's. But Stipe is a hell of a lot better on his feet than Brock is.
It's more of an old school contemplation, because you have a guy who's sublime at wrestling versus a guy who's sublime, which is not without its merit.
Who'd you favor in that fight?
Man, probably Ngannou.
Really?
Yeah.
Brock's cardio is...
I know. I'm just saying off the top of my head I would, but it kind of depend, I guess. You know, like, I don't know. That's a toughie.
Well, you know, the jury's still out on Ngannou in the sense that, like, what happens when he gets into the second and third round, right? True. And if this is a main event, of course, then we have some other issues. But I don't know. I kind of feel like odds makers, I wonder who would be the favorite. Who do you think would be the favorite?
I would think Ngannou would have to be. I mean, okay. Guys like, he's probably...
After what he did to Mark Hunt?
Second best heavyweight there is out there. Maybe second or third best. I mean, you can't really put him much lower than that. And I don't think.
But doesn't the Mark Hunt fight give you pause a little?
It's hard to do, right? Like, because you're like, first of all, you always have he's been away, but then he came back for the Mark Hunt and wins it. Of course, there's asterisks placed all over. But you look back at before in his losses against like Overeem and stuff, he's got the diverticulitis thing, and you're like, well, he was performing at a certain percentage of what he was capable of, and you're just not sure what's myth and what's real with Brock Lesnar sometimes. So, just given that, all the haze kind of surrounding him, I know that there was a big question if he could take a punch for a long time, and all those type of things. I think he's kind of proven he doesn't like to get hit, but he can. He can take a punch. So, I mean, I'd still go with Ngannou just based on evidence that you've seen. But obviously, if he gets taken to the ground right away, all bets are off.
And every second that ticks off a clock, Ngannou ages toward his prime, and Brock ages away from his prime.
There are a lot of smart people who I've talked to who believe that it is imminent that he will come back. That that picture, there was a lot more to it. The picture of him and Dana White. That'd be great. I mean, the guy is a star. There's no doubt about it. He brings something to the table. He is a lot older now. I mean, he is
just like the free agency in NFL. They get Ronda Rousey. We get Brock Lesnar back.
Okay, I wasn't contemplating this, but who wins that trade? Brock Lesnar for Ronda Rousey in 2018. Who wins that trade? Who's more lucrative?
Tough. I don't follow WWE enough, but I do follow it just a little bit because my son
to know the impact.
To know a little bit of the impact, and then some of the people who cover it.
Yeah.
And I feel like the jury's still out with them, because there's just a lot of unknowns. Sure. But I feel like they're giving her every chance, and they want to see her succeed, which is a big deal. But Brock, man, I mean, he's been a needle mover.
He's a proven commodity.
Right? So I still think that the most obvious one would be Brock Lesnar coming over this way.
Yeah, he has proven himself to be a superstar in two sports, and she proved herself to be a superstar in one, and now is going over to this form of entertainment that requires her to do something that she's not necessarily shown herself to be very good at, which is the mic stuff.
The great thing for
not that Brock did, but he had Paul Heyman to do it for
Even in the UFC, though, he didn't really need to. He could be just curmudgeon, just show up, and people it's a specimen.
And nor did she. Nor did Rousey. Rousey didn't need to be that in the UFC. Brock didn't need to be that in the UFC, but in wrestling, it seems like that's kind of.
He seemed like such a crotchety dude. For that whole UFC 200 lead up, he's just sitting there and people ask him about Canada and just things like that, and it's just like he wouldn't.
He is the only fighter that I've stood next to where I will admit that I felt somewhat intimidated just by his presence, that he was going to eat my head off. The guy, I don't know if you've ever stood next to him, but he is a very large fellow.
Yes, he is.
He is a very large fellow. So yeah, that is an interesting one to contemplate. Okay, so we'll see what happens with Brock Lesnar and Ngannou is coming back, and I guess the good news for the UFC is they do have some fresh faces at heavyweight. It's been a while since we've said that. Okay, let's move along. There's a lot of juicy topics this week. I want to talk about this fight that someone came out of nowhere, and it's Frankie Edgar versus Cub Swanson 2 in Atlantic City next month, April 21st. 19 days ago, guys, Frankie Edgar was knocked out by Brian Ortega. 19 days ago, Frankie Edgar suffered the first stoppage loss of his career. How do you feel about him returning in essentially, what, less than a month now, to fight a guy who he thoroughly dominated around 3 or so years ago? Who, by the way, congratulations to Cub Swanson. He has re-signed with UFC.
There's so many.
Yeah, we could talk about that. How do you feel about this, Chuck?
Uncomfortable, because, I mean, honestly, just seeing him get stopped the way he did for the first time and only 19 days removed from it, and the fight is coming up, what, April 21st?
Yeah. Less than a month.
Less than a month away. I really don't even understand how that can be the case, you know what I mean? But, so I look at it like that. I'm sort of like, well, you know, we saw Michael Bisping after his George St. Pierre fight, turn around and fight Gastelum, and I felt like that was such a mistake in retrospect and in prospect. I was watching it and you're like, I don't know, man, this just doesn't make sense. I kind of feel like that with Frankie, and it's rare that you feel like that with Frankie, even though he did have Cub Swanson's number the first time and he dominated that first fight. You just feel like, are you getting the best version of Frankie Edgar given the circumstances, coming off that knockout and then the truncated window in which he's going to have to prepare to get ready for this fight? So I guess you could look at that as some of the appeal, and also Cub Swanson re-upping on his deal, and also, you know, he hasn't had a lot of rematches with guys he's lost to. The one time I think was like Shannon Gogarty way back in the day.
Wow.
And he was able to win that one. He's with the crew, obviously, like he's got good guys around him. So there's a part of me that's very intrigued to see how he handles himself differently in this fight. But I really more so worry that Frankie Edgar may not be the Frankie Edgar we're used to seeing.
Well, you mentioned the truncated recovery time. Hey, you know, Frankie Edgar has had some fights where he's been damaged, and I would suggest that in the second and third fight, both of them with Gray Maynard, Maynard probably inflicted nearly as much damage on Edgar as Ortega did in the knockout. Yeah. And in those cases, Frankie had not almost 2 months to recover, but he had 1 minute to recover and come out for round two. So he's clearly shown himself to be
Henderson too with that up kick.
Right, he's shown himself to be a resilient dude. And I understand why Frankie Edgar would want to jump back on the horse as quickly as he can. This has never happened to him. He's never been knocked out. It's foreign to him. He just wants to right the wrong. So I understand why he, and to some extent why his team, would want to get him back in there. I do share some of Chuck's trepidation about the recovery time. I do think it's kind of it's again good booking to put him on the Jersey Shore. He is the greatest Jersey Shore fighter.
Lure, besides just wanting to get back on. I'm guessing that this New Jersey.
Well, I mean, they did a good job. I mean, I don't know the entire card, but I know Jim Miller, a Jersey guy, but he's a North Jersey guy. Frankie is a Jersey Shore dude, and this is a fight not in his neighborhood, but in his ballpark at least. So I understand why they're doing it, but I just hope that they're making the right call.
My understanding is that the UFC didn't come calling to him; he came calling to them. He wanted to be on this card. In fact, he said before the Ortega fight that he wanted to be on this card because of the Jersey. He hasn't fought a lot close to home. He fought in MSG recently, but for the longest time he was fighting on the West Coast, Abu Dhabi, Boston, close enough, but very rarely is he fighting like really, you know.
I don't know that he's ever fought in a UFC. I think he's fought in Atlantic City, but I don't think he's fought in a UFC fight card in Atlantic City. And and I know a lot of the other Jersey guys have. And but I understand why he would want to do this.
But does the UFC have an obligation to say, like, you know what? Because here's the thing: he's fighting in a month, but he has to train, and he has a medical suspension that expires in early April. Now, you know, is the commission where he fought in Nevada, is the Nevada commission coming to his gym to see if he's not getting punched in the face? That's the problem. It's really the training for this fight that kind of makes you feel a little weird.
Like if you know Frankie Edgar at all, you're like, I really don't think.
And what is there to gain from other than money, which, hey, you got to make a living? To fight a guy who you thoroughly dominated not that long ago, it's hard to top that,
that's
right?
Even the weird. So that's the next element to it. Is just like, what do you prove in that fight? Because let's say you even do it again, you've already done it once, but at the same time, I guess if he had his heart set on fighting in New Jersey and he feels like he's capable of doing it, I guess he was probably going to fight anybody.
Okay, so you say for the UFC, it's a no-brainer in the sense that he's going to sell tickets, right? Kevin Lee and Edson Barbosa are not local guys. I know Barbosa lives in Jersey, but you know
he trains there.
Yeah, but you know Frankie Edgar is New Jersey.
He is Jersey, yes.
MMA. That's why I thought that they should have done the Jimmy Rivera Marlon Moraes fight because those guys are more Jersey than the ones who are headlining. Right. Regardless, does the UFC almost, because I was asked the question, I didn't pick it because we were going to talk about it on the show, but do they have an obligation to say, Frankie, like, live to fight another day? We're going to Utica in June. It's kind of close, you know. Let's put you on that card. Do they have an obligation to the guys, or do they say, hey, look, this fell in our laps. The guy wants to fight. Let's just make the fight. You know?
So tough because we talk about like just trying to tailor. Obviously, this is extenuating circumstances, but we talk about like if you can tailor an event to a local guy, you do it. And my guess is, I know if you talk to him, he's not just New Jersey guy. He's proudly a New Jersey guy, and I think that he's like, Tom's River's not so far from, from there. And I think it's just one of those situations he really wanted to do it. And how do you tell some guy who's just been there in the company that long? He debuted at UFC 63 or something like that. I mean, the guy's been there for so long. You got to kind of trust him, I think. I would give him the leeway. You can understand the UFC.
I mean, I think it's a tough thing, and the UFC certainly in the guise of Dana White have told fighters that they're not going to fight. But certainly the most famous one being Chuck Liddell.
Yeah.
But very close relationship between the UFC president and the fighter. So how much was that an institutional decision, and how much was just one guy saying, this guy's my buddy, and I really don't want him to.
I love Frankie Edgar for a lot of reasons, but I always love that you just never know what Frankie Edgar's going to do. Like he accepts things that you always have to kind of like justify, and then like, well, he's Frankie Edgar, because I mean everything, even just taking this Brian Ortega fight after the whole Max, you're like, oh, Frankie Edgar, what a great guy, because this was a risky thing for him to do. I feel like he's been that guy for so long, and it's part of the reason you can't help but like the guy.
Oh yeah,
Over time, I mean,
even his Instagram post about being a warrior and all this stuff, and
I mean, people are trying to go down to 135, and you're like, yeah, he probably could do that, and it would like freshen up everything again, and then instead he goes the other way. He's like that. Yeah,
maybe this is not as much for the UFC, but for the New Jersey Commission. Maybe they need to, in cases like this, have a protocol for a person lost by knockout X amount of weeks ago. They need to take these extra tests. I mean, I remember back when Bellator was doing the, I guess it was the Ken Shamrock fight, and he hadn't fought for forever. And I remember asking the commission, I think, was that maybe St. Louis? I don't remember wherever there was a fight card.
Texas, maybe.
Yeah, wherever it was. I remember asking the commission, and they went over all the different things that they were having him do that they weren't having all the rest of the fighters in that card do. And I don't know if these things amount to we're just doing things to make it look good, or whether they're actually doing things to protect the athletes. But I would think that this would be a case where the commission could and should have some sort of extra parameters for when athletes have been knocked out.
Besides all that stuff, it is kind of old school matchmaking in the sense of both guys are coming off a loss after win streaks. So it's kind of, you remember they used to always try to match up guys who had equal momentums, and I feel like they found a good match in that sense.
Selfishly, I wish this was, NBA, NFL, MLB, where we know what guys are making, because I'm curious to see what Cub Swanson got after rolling the dice but losing to Brian Ortega. You want to see, okay, did he get an increase in pay in his purse? Is he just getting shown? Like what's happened here? Because all we know is that he's back, but we don't know. Just the fact that he's back, are you surprised by this, or did you expect him, after all these years never getting that title shot? He was getting a little more vocal about his displeasure with things. Did you think that he was going to jump ship?
I kind of did, to be honest. I thought that's why he was playing it out. Yeah, that's what I thought would happen. I thought also there would be mutual, and I don't know to what extent, maybe you know more about this than me, but I thought there'd be some pretty big interest, honestly, from some of the other promotions.
Even though he's off a loss?
Yeah. I mean, because he's a guy who, before then, he'd won, four fights in a row or something like that. He's only 34 years old, and the guy has been around a long time. He still obviously has a ton of skill. I don't feel like you've seen he hasn't. I'm not seeing him on the bad side yet. You're not seeing him decline. So, given all that, I thought there'd be more interest. So I was a little surprised, but at the same time, Dana White, even in December, I remember him saying right away, we want him back and we're going to talk to him and all this stuff. So, as soon as I started seeing that, I was like, maybe he won't get away.
Any thoughts?
Somewhat of the same. I think that I wouldn't have been shocked if I heard that he had signed somewhere else, but it also doesn't shock me that he stayed there. I feel like he was one of those guys in the middle where you didn't know exactly where he was going to be, and I don't think that the loss to Ortega was a killer, because Ortega is Ortega. That's
crazy.
And then I think that the Ortega fight
knocked them both.
Right. When Ortega went out and took out Frankie Edgar, I mean, that even put another feather in that guy's cap. So
By the way, speaking of quick turnarounds, let's go back quickly to UFC 224. Mackenzie Dern is on that card. They announced that last week. She's fighting Amanda Cooper. Do you feel like this is a little too soon for her? Like, we were talking, after her fight at 222, you got to book these guys the right way. Speaking about Sean O'Malley as well, just found out yesterday that he is going to have foot surgery, so he's gone for a foreseeable future. He'll be back in the fall, he hopes. But Dern got beat up in that fight. Black eye, busted lip. She went the distance. and she's fighting someone who's tough in Amanda Cooper. I'm okay with the matchmaking, but I feel like it's a little soon. What do you think?
Yeah. It'd be also, too, she just didn't look, you know, because we followed her. There was a lot of discussion even going into that Yoder fight, like, is she even ready yet to be in the UFC? Well, they match her up with somebody, they think, okay, this is pretty good matchmaking. But yet she struggled. I thought she was, you know, she was very raw in a lot of aspects that you're watching, and it wasn't just this one-sided fight. In fact, she barely got by that fight. So given that, I thought that she might want to go back to the gym and just kind of tighten some things up before she steps back in there. But again, I guess if it's Rio de Janeiro and they believe that it's a good match, I guess there's no big deal with it. But I would like to see her just get better. I think that's the whole thing.
Exactly.
I want to see her improve before she gets back in there. I mean, otherwise, I mean, imagine if Cooper wins this fight. What did they gain from doing that?
It's hard to
I don't think of it as her being too soon. Certainly not in the Frankie Edgar sense of
oh, no.
But in terms of, look, after you have a performance like she did, which was certainly a winning performance, but not spectacular, you either go back to the gym and work at the gym, or you take another fight that is at an appropriate level. And I think this fight is at an appropriate level. I mean, you know, Cooper's 3-3. And her 3 losses have all been by submission. So that is the kind of opponent that that Mackenzie Dern certainly wants to be in there with. But she also got 3 wins, and so she's not like a pushover. You know, this is an opportunity for Dern to get better, and I suppose different athletes look at things differently. Some would think they need to be in the gym perpetually, but she might be one of those people who just feels better competing.
So 2+ months, you have no reason.
I don't. I mean, I don't think that it's. She's going to learn something from being in this fight.
Interesting. Okay. All right.
So it's not the lesson of, whoops, what do you do after a loss now?
Well, exactly. That is a good point. I know she really wanted to fight in Brazil. Her dad's from Brazil. It just feels like a little too soon to come back because you do have to heal up a little bit. But maybe
not a huge step up. I mean,
sure, that is true.
It's I think that was what made it okay for me, that it's an appropriate matchmaking.
Cooper says she's been training for this fight since
she was born.
Yes, pretty much.
You know, in boxing, when you're, you know, a young prospect, you're fighting every like 2-3 months. However, you're coming off probably an amateur career. There's a lot. She's kind of just like figuring this out on the fly, which is. And
different. These are, no matter what, they're still UFC cows. They've been in the UFC. Sure. It's not like they're just handpicking people on the regional scene, saying like, let's get some wins against these guys. You know what I mean? So.
All right. All of a sudden, though, that card is getting more interesting by the day. So I'm sure the Rio fans are happy about this. Okay. So one last topic before we move over to After the Beat, which, by the way, is exclusively on Twitter. You've sent us some questions. We'll get to those in around 10 minutes. But I want to ask you guys about the fascination with crossover fights in combat sports. I saw Josh Gross and our colleague Luke Thomas talking about this a little bit on Twitter. And there's this, this new story emerging, which is not necessarily crossover, but the Anthony Joshua flirtation with Dana White. Worth noting before we talk, that flirtation is not for him to fight in the UFC. Right. I keep seeing UFC, it's for the Zuffa boxing idea.
So it's crossover only from Dana White's perspective.
Exactly. Yeah. But, I get asked about Mayweather fighting in MMA every day. I'm sure you guys do as well. Stipe Miocic is jumping in and saying, Anthony, I'm ready for you. And we're seeing this stuff every day. Someone, Gervonta Davis recently saying, I want to do UFC.
Cyborg.
Yeah. We have seen the story before, many different iterations of it over the years. And it never works out for the guy who crosses over. Maybe, who was it? Ray Mercer, who had the knockout of Tim Sylvia. Yes. Although there were some funky rules with that one. But more often than not, it never works out. Yet there continues to be this intense fascination with this. Why?
I think you may be asking the wrong people. I'm so not fascinated by it.
So, but clearly Chuck, the public is, right?
You go ahead.
Yeah.
Do you understand why the public? Can you understand why?
So for Conor McGregor to go and fight in boxing against Floyd Mayweather, it was so ridiculous and so audacious that I felt like it worked on that level. It's functioned on that level to begin with. There was a partition there. It came down. It was kind of like your wildest imagination had come to life. So it's like you can understand that. But now all the charms have kind of been dished off on that. So to bring Floyd Mayweather, 40 years old, who's never trained in MMA, I don't care who's training him or for how amount of time at this age, I just don't even understand it because I don't see, even if you say, well, now Conor gets his chance to show Floyd what it's like to be in that. What is there in that? Because the sport isn't really based on like, okay, you beat me at mine, I'm going to beat you. It's always about like guys who the doubt of the contender taking out the guy who's invincible. That's you know what I mean? It's always about the guy beating the guy. So
you don't have any doubt though that this would do incredibly well on pay-per-view, right?
I don't, because I think, I mean, it will do well on pay-per-view if it happened, because the bottom line is, as we know, in this bubble, we can be sick of anything. We can know the truth of anything. We can see the decay of things. But on the outside, where everything sells in the casual world, and that's once it gets out to there, I still think that that's what would be the, you know, the deciding factor. I think that there would be some fascination among casuals who don't pay any attention, who don't get inundated with these kinds of things, and don't contemplate this. Just see Floyd Mayweather now crossing over the other way. I'll buy it. You know,
they don't think
also,
about that he's a fish out of water.
Well, he's a guy who is, you know, he's been for his entire career the big fish in waters where all the other fish that might be dangerous were somewhere else, because he just, you know, he had made the most money with the least risk. That was his boxing career, and now we're talking about him doing something in a sport where they get paid less money, MMA, than in boxing, and it would be a bigger risk. So it makes no sense at all, as you know. But that's not really why people buy the fights. I mean, people will buy it because, you know, those people who hated Mayweather through his entire boxing career and wanted to see him get beat up and never saw him get beat up will be like, okay, maybe now's his chance to get beat up.
And there's so very few people, Conor McGregor being the big exception, obviously, who could go over to boxing and it'd be a big event. Even if Nate Diaz said tomorrow, you know, it'd be really interested to see Nate Diaz, who I think we understand is a pretty big star in our sport. Yeah. What would that be like if he translated if he went over to boxing? Right. I just don't know.
It's funny you say that to me, because someone said to me yesterday, Anthony Joshua versus Stipe Miocic in boxing, two heavyweights, right, the respective heavyweight champions, would do better on pay-per-view than Mayweather McGregor. I said, you are absolutely out of your mind. There's no way.
Yeah, there's no way.
This concept only works for a very, very, very select few, right?
And they know.
I mean, it would work for that. They certainly would make a lot of money, but I don't think it would not get to this point with this fight, because I mean, these guys made their money not once they stepped into the ring. They made their money by talking about it.
But why is there this fascination when we know what's going to happen every time? We know.
That's what I'm saying. I don't think anybody reasonable within the MMA bubble would see it as a competitive fight. They're talking about a guy who the only reason he was a match in the boxing is because he was sublime in the octagon. He was able to do these things. Now you're going to bring a guy who has almost no knowledge of ground game into that situation.
What's a bigger mismatch? Like, to me, I was able to suspend disbelief that, okay, fine, you know, as crazy as it is, if Conor caught him with a left, he'll knock out Floyd. To me, there is a greater chance of that happening than Floyd coming into MMA and doing so. What is he going to do?
I think that we have to recognize that these are two, that we can call them crossover fights and lump them together under the same umbrella, but they're really two different things. On the one hand, when an MMA fighter goes into a boxing ring, that person is taking with him the skills that he has already established, stand-up, you know, boxing and punching skills, but then is like leaving behind those other skills, kicking and grappling. But you already have the skills of using your hands, and you're trying to see whether those are better than what the boxer can do. A boxer going into an octagon he gets to bring his boxing skills, but he is going to be demanded of him, you know, kicking skills, wrestling skills, jiu-jitsu skills, all those other things that he doesn't have. And so these are not the same thing. This is having a boxer step into a MMA fight is not the same thing as having an MMA fighter step into a boxing.
Even somebody like Holly Holm, obviously, like who had a big boxing career before switching over, had to almost unlearn what made her great as a boxer to learn MMA boxing, because there's always the threat of a lot of different things. And so it's like, you just look at those things and you saw we had to watch her come along kind of incrementally to get to the point where then she's fighting Ronda Rousey and knocking Ronda Rousey out. But there was a little bit of a build there, and you had to kind of watch it. I remember her first couple of fights. She had a couple of, what was it, LFA or
Legacy.
Yeah, so it's like she was in a couple of those, and I remember thinking, she's pretty, it's going to be a while, and it did. It took her a little while, and obviously I don't think she's turned into, she's been a very good martial arts. She's been a champion, but I don't think she's the most well-rounded even right now.
You know, it's the part I can't quite wrap my head around. So we all understood why Conor was angling for the Floyd boxing match, because he can make a hell of a lot more money in that fight, and that's been proven, right? Even if he comes back to the UFC, I don't know if he makes as much money given the model that they're dealing with. I believe that Floyd makes as much, if not more money, continuing to be a boxer, where he's arguably the greatest ever, right? where he's 50-0, all that stuff and more, where he's a proven commodity, than if he comes over to the sport that he knows nothing about at 41 years old and has to, learn all these new techniques. That's the part I can't wrap. It's not like he goes to MMA and makes more money. So if you're willing to keep going, if you're willing to keep fighting, why not just stick with that sport? Is it because he doesn't want to tarnish the 50-0 because now there's a chance he might lose, and if he loses in MMA, well, no one expected you to win? I don't understand why there's even a flirtation. Or is it maybe this, deal that Dana White and him did?
Every time these things start rolling downhill, I can't answer it either. It's like the bottom line is it always seems like this is stupid to stop talking about.
Doesn't it feel like deja vu all over again? Like that we're talking about this just under different circumstances? It's like last year.
Well, except that as you set up the question, there was some logic behind Conor McGregor wanting to make that leap, and it proved that he was accurate. He can make a ton of money, so good for him. It's not equal. I mean, Floyd Mayweather leaping in this direction is not a safe route, and it's certainly not as lucrative as it could be. So I keep saying it's not going to happen, and I just leave it at that. And, I know that we'll be sitting here 6 months from now saying, well, so that big fight's going to happen this weekend.
There really is a point, though. It really is that you come down to it and you think, I just want to see the best guys fight the best guys.
Yes.
Because this is why you are in the sport. You're talking about the Bill Simmons thing. Yes, but that's the beauty of are when you can't imagine two guys losing.
Okay, do it on a cover. So don't take steps into the octagon with Dana White, who's like now.
I'll tell you what I miss. I was documentary Notorious on Netflix.
Yeah.
And Aldo gets hurt, and then he fights messed up, and he messed it up a second time though, and they're essentially like, who's next, And I miss Lee. Whatever you want to say about him, and a lot of it is warranted. Fine, this guy was down to fight anyone, and he had a. I want that guy back. We need that guy back. And I also watched the Michael Jordan 30 for 30 recently, and that was a nice little fun thing. Here's Jordan swinging, he's wearing but at the end of the day, we want to see the best doing what they're best at, and I miss seeing Conor. Like, I don't want to see him involved with the Floyd stuff anymore. Shows, I get it, but I want to see him fight Tony Ferguson or Khabib Nurmagomedov. I miss that.
He's not needed in the Floyd thing. The Floyd circus in MMA.
I wrote about this a little bit. There's a pop relevance, right? You're in pop culture, pop relevance. That's kind of where the Mayweather stuff is. Then there's the vital relevance, the reason he's there. That was how he got there. I want to see it go back to the vital side of it, because it's like that's where the lifeblood was at, was when he was doing that. Like, I know what you're talking about with that. You forget, people give him a lot of hell because of where he
amazing.
And how he just any negativity he could just block out. People could, because I remember when the Chad Mendes, people were like, dude, this is crazy. He shouldn't be taking this fight. Did he do that? He didn't have the negative.
Camp, but you watch it like, okay, so he fights, and this is not, I'm not trying to, celebrate Conor here because we're talking about something different, but like you watch him fight Brimage, and then he comes right back and he fights, suffers a torn ACL, and he comes back in 11 months to fight Brandao, and then comes back, 2 months later to fight Poirier, and then comes back 3 months later to fight Dennis Siver. Like, it was just continuous. And then, of course,
honestly, Nurmagomedov or Ferguson as a career escalation still, because I felt like as long as he saw escalation, motivated him, he wanted, that's how he was, all those things, that's what he likes. But to defend is a whole different psychological thing, and I feel like that's where we're at.
He doesn't have a rear view mirror in his vehicle. He's going, look.
One thing is for certain, though, we're going to, for 30,
wait till Luke's back, though?
Well, no, but I'm just saying, like, even when we're 80 years old, there will be some remember Ali and Inoki and Strangler Lewis? I mean, this stuff goes, Gorgeous George, this stuff goes back, I mean, the UFC stuff. It's just, at times, you just want to see the best compete against the best in their respective sports. Okay, fun show, guys. Still a little more to go. Now what we're going to do, we're going to go exclusively on Twitter live, twitter.com/MMA Fighting. There's the address. You have been sending us some questions, as you are known to do. Go to Twitter right now. You know the address. We just put it up. We've tweeted before. Same place as always, because the after the beat, is it the after the beat? It's always very confusing. It's after the beat. It's not the after the beat. It's just after the beat.
There's only one the.
Just after the beat. I just got confirmations. Just after the beat. Or it's after the open brackets MMA close bracket beat.
Correct.
There's a lot of different ways.
Just after the beat's even better, because it's like just after.
A lot of people tell me it should be called And the Beat Goes On.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Copyrights, these things are important.
Yeah,
right?
we can talk about that too.
Yes. All right, let's go to Twitter right now. After the beat starts.